I spent 2 days exploring Singapore alone, and somehow, I missed the city's most famous symbol. On my first day after arriving, I headed straight for a bus to the world-famous Singapore Botanic Gardens. Google Maps works perfectly here. I waved at the driver to stop, hopped on, and was already on my way. Despite the rainy weather, walking through the gardens felt like a dream come true. Greenery, nature, and birds singing all around me. This has always been my favorite part of traveling, so I wasn't in any rush. I enjoyed a delicious pastry, drank an iced coffee, and recharged my batteries before continuing my exploration. I danced in the rain, wandered through a section of tropical rainforest, and simply soaked up the atmosphere. It's hard to believe that a place like this exists right in the middle of a huge city. Singapore Botanic Gardens is more than 160 years old and is the only tropical botanical garden in the world to be recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Still, while walking around, I wasn't thinking about records or awards. I was wondering how it was possible that just a few minutes earlier, I had been surrounded by skyscrapers, and now I was walking among palm trees, exotic plants, and enormous tropical trees. Around every corner there seemed to be another path inviting me to explore. One moment I was passing beautifully maintained flower gardens, and the next I felt as if I had stepped into a real jungle. That's exactly the kind of place I love most when I travel. A place where you can slow down, put your phone away, and simply enjoy being there. It was one of those places that makes you forget you're standing in one of the most modern cities in the world. I spent most of my first day in the Botanic Gardens. After that, I decided it was time to test Singapore's metro system and head into the city center. The MRT turned out to be exactly what everyone says it is: modern, clean, and incredibly easy to use. Within minutes, I arrived in Marina Bay and immediately spotted the iconic Marina Bay sands in the distance. It looks like someone placed a giant ship on top of 3 towers and somehow made it work. Right next to it was the Helix bridge, inspired by the shape of a DNA double helix. At that point, I was already falling in love with the city. Then the Art Science Museum came into view. Its lotus flower design stood out against the skyline, and honestly, I didn't know where to look anymore. As the sun started to set, the whole area transformed. The buildings lit up, the skyline reflected in the water, and the city seemed to come alive in a completely different way. Instead of thinking about heading back to my accommodation, I found myself running from one spot to another, looking around in every direction and taking it all in. I felt like a child discovering a new world. Every few minutes I would stop, stare at another building, another view, another reflection, and think, wow! For the first time during a solo trip, I didn't want to go back to my room after dark. I just wanted to keep walking, keep exploring, and see what else Singapore had to show me at night. My second day started with an attempt to get to gardens by the bay. I say attempt because somehow Google Maps decided to send me to the eastern side of the park instead of the main entrance. The funniest part? There wasn't even a viewpoint there. At least the residential buildings were impressive. While walking around, I couldn't stop wondering how much it costs to rent even a tiny apartment in Singapore. Eventually, I made it to Gardens by the Bay South, which was where I was supposed to end up in the first place. That's when the real exploration began. I expected giant futuristic trees, but what I found completely exceeded my expectations. The Supertrees look like something from a science fiction movie. Some of them are as tall as a 16-story building and are covered with thousands of plants from around the world. Standing underneath them made me feel absolutely tiny. Honestly, this place doesn't feel real. It feels like someone took a botanical garden, mixed it with a futuristic city, and somehow made it work. There was just one problem. I couldn't go up onto the Supertree Observatory because a storm was approaching. As soon as thunder is heard, access to the elevated walkways and viewing platforms is suspended for safety reasons. So, what now? Luckily, Gardens by the Bay is much more than just the Supertrees. The park is also home to 2 giant conservatories, Flower Dome and Cloud Forest. I chose Cloud Forest, and honestly, it turned out to be one of the best decisions I made during my time in Singapore. The moment I walked inside, I was greeted by a massive indoor waterfall and a blast of cool air, exactly what I needed after walking around in Singapore's heat and humidity. The entire conservatory recreates the environment of a tropical mountain rainforest, which is basically my ideal habitat. A giant artificial mountain rises through the center of the building, and a winding path takes visitors all the way to the top. Walking along the Cloud Walk and Treetop Walk felt incredible. From above, I could see the entire greenhouse, the waterfall, the vegetation, and tiny people walking far below me. If you are wondering whether Cloud Forest is worth visiting, my answer is simple. Absolutely. I'd come back in a heartbeat. From Cloud Forest, I went straight back to the Supertrees. A few moments later, I was finally up there. The walkway is narrow, high, and it definitely tested my fear of heights. But the views from the top made it all worth it. I didn't regret waiting. I didn't regret visiting Cloud Forest. The only thing I regretted was not seeing the Supertrees at night. Still, walking above all those tiny people below me was absolutely worth it. Determined to see as much as possible, I decided to visit 2 temples before calling it a day. The first was Thian Hock Keng, also known as the Temple of Heavenly Happiness. It is one of the most important Chinese temples in Singapore. But what fascinated me most wasn't the architecture or the decorations. What really caught my attention was the fact that this temple once stood right next to the sea. It was dedicated to Mazu, the Chinese goddess of the sea and protector of sailors. In the past, Chinese immigrants would come here to give thanks for a safe journey and arrival in Singapore. Today, however, the temple stands in the middle of the city, surrounded by skyscrapers and busy streets in the heart of Chinatown. Isn't that incredible? A place that once overlooked the sea is now surrounded by one of the most modern city skylines in the world. Just standing there and imagining what this area looked like more than a century ago made the visit even more interesting. The second temple felt just as out of place in its surroundings. A 4-story building standing among modern skyscrapers is not something you expect to see in the middle of Singapore's business district. This was the Buddha Tooth Relic Temple, home to what is believed to be a sacred relic of Buddha, kept inside a stupa weighing around 320 kilograms. The temple is impressive both inside and out. Gold and deep red colors dominate every corner, creating an atmosphere that feels completely different from the busy streets outside. I spent quite a while looking around, taking in all the details, and trying to imagine the amount of work that went into creating a place like this. Some places are difficult to describe with words, and this is definitely one of them. You really have to see it with your own eyes. If you're looking for ready-made travel plans, practical tips, maps, and interesting facts, you can find everything on my blog. The link is in the description, and if you enjoy solo travel, subscribe to my channel.